Language learning is hard, right? You've probably felt really frustrated, anxious, and just overall annoyed that you're not making progress in the language you're learning. But the thing about that is that all of those emotions generally come from one thing, and that is direction. You actually have a lack of direction in the language you're learning, and that is the reason why it is so difficult. So in this video, I'm going to outline the 7 stages to learning a language from zero and basically take you through from not knowing a language to basically conversational fluency. Stage 1, the essentials. Before you start learning a language, you have to be prepared, and that means doing some things before you actually begin the actual language learning process. So I want you to picture warriors before they go into battle, before they're actually attacking the enemy army. They need to be sharpening their weapons and training, and that's kind of like what we're going to be doing now. So there's 3 main things that you need to do before you actually learn a language, and that is mindset, resources, and then picking the right language itself. So with mindset, the main thing we need to consider is having a growth mindset. A growth mindset, if you don't know, is basically the kind of mental space where you think that you can learn anything given it enough time and effort. Someone who doesn't have a growth mindset has what's called a fixed mindset, and it's basically the idea that talent is kind of tied to luck and genetics, and you can't actually improve how good you are at something with hard work. Whereas the growth mindset is basically that results are the product of the effort you put in, and the person who tries the hardest will make the most progress. That's obviously the case with language learning, but I think a lot of people go into it and get really frustrated that they're not just understanding things straight away. And what you got to understand is that this is something completely new, and it's going to take time to become proficient at it. So that's mindset out of the way. The second thing that you need to make sure you're nailing down is resources. And by resources, I mean the things that you absolutely need to learn a language. So the 2 main things I recommend are a notebook and a Google folder that you have saved. So for a notebook, literally just something that you can write notes down in when you're studying. It doesn't have to be fancy, but don't use like a piece of paper. Try and have an actual book that you can take notes in. Don't use a digital notebook. I'd recommend you have a physical one. It's just better because you can practice journaling in it, and it's just overall better. Trust me on that one. With a Google folder, I literally mean a folder where you can save websites, YouTube channels, guides, etc. Anything on the internet that you might be using to learn a language, and just have one place where you can find it, and it's really convenient. The third thing we need that is absolutely essential is to pick the right language. And if you're watching this video, you've either already started or you have kind of a rough idea of the type of language you want to be learning, or you have a rough idea of the language that you are learning. But it's just very important to set yourself up from the beginning with a language that's going to be beneficial for you. I think a lot of people, when they start learning a language, they're not actually obsessed with that language. They just kind of want to learn a language. And if that's you, definitely make sure that you have set yourself up with a language that is going to be easy enough that you can achieve it without extreme difficulty. Like if this is your first language, I'd recommend learning either a Romance language or a Germanic language, not a language from Asia or anything like that, just because it is extremely difficult. Of course, if you're learning a language to talk to someone, then you kind of have a better idea of which language you're going to be learning. But that is basically just to help people who aren't sure on which language, so they don't get stuck with a language they don't particularly enjoy. Once you've ticked off these boxes, great, we're actually ready to start learning the language. Stage 2, lockdown. So before we go all out with actually learning the language, it's important to basically lock down the basics. So if we go back to that idea of the warriors, it's basically like them, instead of just rushing straight into war, they're kind of like locking down their kingdom, preparing for the kind of incoming army to advance. So I think the truth is most learners don't learn smart from the start, and that is kind of why there is like a 99 or 99.5% failure rate with language learners, just because they don't learn smart from the start, and when it gets to that point later on, they haven't actually set themselves up for success. So to start with in the language you're learning, I definitely recommend you learn the alphabet first. If your language uses the same alphabet as English or whatever your native language is, then of course you don't need to do that. But definitely this stage is all about familiarization. So learn the alphabet. I'd highly recommend you also watch a guide of a native speaker kind of going through the alphabet and pronouncing it, even if it is using the English alphabet, like Italian, for example. Just kind of go through the pronunciation, basically, I found is super useful. I'd also recommend we start using that folder we talked about earlier to save things that are useful. So try and save at least 2 different YouTubers and at least 2 different guides. I found is best. Having more than one source that you're actually learning from is definitely better than only learning from one thing. We're basically going to be using that folder for 2 types of things: guides to kind of understand how the language works better, and then content so that we can actually practice listening, reading, etc. with that. So I'd recommend straight up that you save some kind of content for you to kind of read or listen. Content basically just means things that you can either read in that language or listen to. So even as a complete beginner, it's just good to have this to start off. I'd recommend you save at least one website with kind of short practice paragraph stories for beginners in your language. Even if that is kind of a little bit too difficult, just save it. And then also save one YouTuber that does kind of vlog type videos that you can actually listen to that are probably with subtitles that are easy enough for you to try and follow along, even if you can't understand them. I'd also recommend you save a YouTuber who explains things in that language, so a native speaker, and then try and find a full guide that goes through the language, and you can save that to kind of look at as well. I'd also recommend that this is kind of the stage that you would set goals at. So set yourself a goal in the language you're learning, and I'll say straight away, there's definitely a wrong way to do this. The wrong way to set goals in a language is to say, okay, I'm going to be fluent by the end of the year or the end of next year or anything like that. That is not a good way to go about it, just because you don't know how long it's going to take you to become proficient in that language. So it's better that you set yourself a short-term goal. For example, I'm going to study 3 hours a week or something like that, something that you actually have control over, and then meet that, instead of setting yourself a long-term goal. That's really difficult. So set yourself a goal, write it down in your journal, and then write down the system of how you're going to achieve it. So if your goal is, for example, I'm going to study 3 hours a week for, the next few weeks, whatever, and then you can give yourself an actual habit tracker to tick off with the kind of habits you're going to set yourself. So for example, if you set yourself the goal of, I'm going to do half an hour of study every single day, which is a little bit ambitious, but you can definitely do that. You could say, I'm going to do 1 deck of flashcards and I'm going to read 1 practice paragraph every single day, just as a random example, and then you could tick it off in your habit tracker. But basically, once you've done all those things and you kind of learned some basic words like the, and then greetings, it's time to move on to the next stage. Stage 3, lead the charge. At this point, you're probably filled with a lot of energy and motivation, and that's definitely great. We're going to use it at this point, sprint. So now that we've set ourselves up, I want you to picture the warriors actually charging into battle at this point. That's kind of like you with language learning. The best place to start, I've found, is with what's called subject pronouns. So subject pronouns are basically words like I, you, he, she, and this is a really good place to start for beginners because it kind of sets yourself up for how a language works in regards to a lot of other things. Just trust me with that one. So what you're going to do is learn the subject pronouns in the language you're studying, and then also kind of some basic verbs to go along with them. And I definitely recommend when you're learning common words that you start using flashcards. So if you've never used flashcards before, I'd highly recommend you use digital flashcards. There's plenty of free digital flashcards on the internet, like Study Stack and I believe Anki, that you can download and use. And you can also actually save decks that other people have put on there. So if you're learning Russian, for example, you can type in Russian animals and save a deck that someone else has made, and you don't actually have to make the flashcards yourself. So that's super useful. At this point, we also want to be ironing out our habit tracker to kind of make sure that it's going well. If you want to see a full guide on habit trackers, definitely check out my video. But a habit tracker is basically something that you have where you give yourself a list of tasks to do and you basically tick it off every single day. So for example, you might have 3 habits in a day. It might be watch 1 vlog in the language you're learning, read 1 practice paragraph, and then do 1 deck of flashcards, for example. And then each day you tick it off when you do it, and ideally you would have filled out the whole habit tracker across a week. We want to be making sure our habit tracker is as good as possible, basically for our personality and how we language learn. So try and make sure the habits in your habit tracker aren't unachievable, they're not too difficult, but they're difficult enough that you are actually making progress in the language. And I'd also recommend you reflect on your goals at this point. So if you're finding it difficult to meet the amount of time you said you're going to study, it might be better to adjust it. But yeah, just have a look over that and see how that's going. Once you can put together some correct basic sentences, we're ready to kind of go to the next stage. Stage 4, explore. So this is where we're really going to get going with language learning. I want you to picture the warriors from before. They've basically smashed the front line of enemies and they're spreading out to block all the ways out of the enemy kingdom. So at this stage, we're kind of focusing on learning a lot more words than before. So we've got our basics down. We started with a really solid foundation and we're going to learn a bunch of new words so that you can actually talk about a wide variety of things. So I want you to do an exercise that I call a topic mind map, and it's basically where you write out 5 topics that kind of interest you in your personal life. So it could be, for example, Harry Potter, the gym, painting, literally anything, and just write 20 words that relate to each topic. If your topic was, for example, James Bond, you might write gun, spy, literally anything like that, just 20 words. And that gives you a really solid foundation of 100 words that you can then kind of put into the flashcards and memorize, and then you can actually talk about a little bit about a lot of different things. You can of course do more topics, you can do more words, it's up to you. But I've just found that kind of solid base is really, really useful. We're also going to start with verb conjugation in this area. So if you don't know what the word verb conjugation means, don't worry. It's basically the idea that action words change depending on who's saying them. So in English, we would say he eats, and then we would say I eat. The word eat changes slightly, And that's the case in all languages. So you're going to start to learn how action words change in the language you're learning, and that can be a little bit difficult. So I'd highly recommend you look up on YouTube a native speaker of the language and find a playlist where they're actually explaining the videos. By the way, if you need help with finding anything in the language you're learning, comment down below and I'll try and respond and give you a hand. We're also going to start exploring interrogatives, and an interrogative is basically a questioning word so that we can actually start to ask and answer questions. And then we're also going to look into adjectives, so describing words and that kind of thing. This stage can take months because it is quite intensive, but by the end, we're going to be looking to answer simple questions in the language you're learning and try and be mostly right. Stage 5, Invade. By this point, if you haven't already, you are definitely ready to have your first conversation. So it's not going to be perfect by any stretch, but you can talk to a native speaker at this stage about some like kind of basic topics. If we go back to our metaphor of the warriors, at this point, they've basically smashed down the walls of the enemy kingdom and then gone into it. So we're doing really good. You've actually made it further than probably 95% of people who try and learn a language. So we want to ensure that we're mastering verb conjugation and different word types, so conjunctions, prepositions, adverbs, etc., so that we can talk in a bunch of different ways and kind of talk about a wide variety of things. If you haven't heard of the input repetition method, I'd highly recommend you check out my video on it. It's basically a technique we use to learn new words that we're unfamiliar with. So there's two parts to it, input and repetition. The input is basically you're reading books or watching videos, listening to things, etc. in the language, and then the repetition is you're taking all the words you don't know, putting them into flashcards and memorizing them. I'd highly recommend you check out the video I've already made on it. It is a super useful technique for learning new words. If you are starting to feel demotivated at this stage as well, that's completely normal and at any stage. So I definitely recommend you give yourself kind of a reward and a pat on the back for making it this far. Now that you're at the level where you can actually put together a sophisticated sentence, I definitely recommend you try gratitude journaling in the language you're learning, because it is a really good way to kind of show yourself that you are actually capable of writing in that language. And I'd also recommend win stacking, which is basically where you kind of give yourself one thing each day that you're proud that you did, and you can look back on it over time and see that you have actually put in a lot of work. Once you can basically kind of talk about the things that have happened in your day, you know that you're actually making really good progress in the language, and you're able to move on to stage 6, which is conquer. So picture the warriors now conquering the enemy kingdom. They've literally destroyed it. They've got rid of all the other warriors and now they're in charge, but there is still a little bit of work left to do. At this point, I'd recommend you start trying to consume content in the language you're learning that you would already read and listen to in your native language. So for example, if you read Harry Potter in your native language, you can try doing this in your target language. You're not going to be perfect by any stretch, but you will be able to kind of make it out a little bit and then do the input repetition for any word, input repetition method for any words that you don't know. You can also try maximum immersion at this point. Maximum immersion is basically kind of trying to use your language as much as you can in your life. So for example, whenever you need to Google something, Googling in that language, putting your to-do list in that language, and then even studying in that language. If you have a problem, you can kind of search it in the language, etc. The videos you watch of native speakers explaining things to you to try and help you become a better language learner can also be in the language that you're learning. I'd also recommend at this point we start going into tense. So tense is basically the idea of talking in the past and the future as well as the present, and this is definitely a good time to start doing that. If you don't know a native speaker that you can talk to, I'd highly recommend hiring one online. There's tons of websites where you can jump on FaceTime with someone for a really, really low price and basically have them talk to you and pull you up on any little mistakes you're making in the language. Once you do this for a while, you should soon come to a level where you can read kind of difficult stories. So for example, Harry Potter in your target language with a reasonable amount of success. If you can do this, we're definitely on to the final stage. Stage 7, riches. We're almost there, and at this point, we're ready to start consuming content for natives. So if you're learning Italian, at this point, you would start reading books written for Italians in Italian. The same goes for movies, TV, podcasts, etc. Now that we're at the 7th and final stage, we're ready to basically maximize our output. So you should be trying to journal every single day. You should be talking to people frequently. You can also start working on a passion project. So if you want to write a short story in that language or make a board game, literally anything else, that can be super useful in that language because it will help you kind of become better at it. You can also plan a holiday and a bunch of other things. At this point, we basically want to have mastered all verb conjugation as well. The warriors have won the war, your kingdom's wealth has accelerated into prosperity, and it's time to decide what you want to do next. So at this point, you can speak the language conversationally. You're not quite fluent, but you can speak it. So you might be wondering what to do now. You basically have 3 options. You can either progress beyond stage 7 and try and get closer and closer to fluency by continuing to speak and learn the language. Option 2 is you can learn a new language and conquer elsewhere. And option 3 is you can take a well-earned break from language learning and just basically enjoy yourself. But no matter what you do, the important thing to remember is that you've done something that most learners will never do, and you've actually achieved your goal and learnt the language, which is something that a lot of people can't even fathom. And that was you before you started learning. So definitely be proud of yourself. And once you have done that and reached this final stage, remember this video and come back and hit the subscribe button. Guys, thank you. That is the video. I've got links in my description to my coaching, my Discord, and yeah, have a good one.